holiday. Celebrating his birthday.
Or at least a late start.
Good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Wednesday, May 21st, 2025 at 9:07 in the morning. So we are here to begin our day by looking at an amendment proposal to the House Ways and Means amendment proposal. So we have our legislative counsel, John Gray, with us. John, good morning. Thank you for finally being able to join us this morning. Good morning. I don't know, have you been on vacation?
It's been a light lift this session, so I've just been chilling. Good morning, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Shall we jump in?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we're looking at a proposed amendment to S-127, and what you're seeing here is not a strike all. What this does is just strikes the existing tax increment financing sections or CHIP sections in the S-127 and replaces them in total with what is proposed here. That said, this is not a complete overhaul of everything that you have seen. It will show highlighting reflects changes against what came out of House Ways and Means. But for ease of reading, this just replaces sections 25 through 27. So I will go, I guess at whatever pace you guys would like. I don't think it's going to be terribly hard to explain the changes that are proposed here. So the first place to look in our definition section is on page 4. We previously had a concept of middle income housing. And we've now just updated that to reference mixed income. As you can just think about just conceptually, the developments would be, 20% devoted to whatever income level housing you're specifying. So mixed income is a bit more accurate, I guess, as to what the development itself would be. You would have some at a particular level and you would have others at a different level. So this is not a substantive shift. It's just a shift to call out what the actual concept is. And note again, we've talked about this before, but this housing subsidy covenant can be targeted to different income levels. So it also speaks to that piece. Mixed income, you could have mixed income housing that is targeted at a very low level. You could have it at a higher level. So not a substantive change, just calling out a perhaps more accurate term to describe this.
Because we were talking about it and we were like using that phrase of mixed income housing.
With that shift, there is a slight change. I wouldn't call it really too much of a substantive change to the purpose section, although there is some clarifying language here. So the purpose of the program is to encourage the development of new primary residences for households of low and moderate income. We couldn't call out mixed income because the households themselves wouldn't be mixed income. It would be, right? So households of low and moderate income, and then maybe the more meaningful shift here across both rural and urban areas of all Vermont counties. So this is an attempt to say that this is meant to be available statewide, and lest you think that that is purely a rhetorical shift. If you think about the fact that the purpose has to be built into particular analyses, and that VEPC, if you have a cap in place, will be looking to the purpose section, this could affect the way that prioritization and the like is done, but that would depend on rulemaking. So just to call out, it's not merely a rhetorical shift. This is a meaningful effort to say this is meant to be made available across the state and not just in specific areas. Okay, we can jump next to the application section, which is section 1910. So that is on page 8. And what you're not going to see is what used to be subdivision B. And what this is really getting at is we previously had a section that set up an application process whereby VEPC would recommend, they would go through this whole process and they would recommend to the CHIP board applications that they think meet all the standards, and then the CHIP board would sign off on the work that VEPC had been done. The CHIP board is removed in this proposal, and so that subsection B that speaks to that piece has been removed, and later on the section that is devoted to standing up that CHIP board has been removed as well. So simply put, no CHIP board in this amendment. You'll see cleanup language for or conforming changes for that mixed income piece. And the way that you're really going to see the shift for removal of the chipboard is here on page 11. We now have this, subsection B previously talked about the standards you had to meet to get an application through this process, and it said, recommendation to the board. We've now moved this to the end of the section because you'll have gone through this process. And we're saying, what does VEPC have to do? So VEPC shall approve or deny an application. And there's a timeline, not later than 45 days following receipt of a completed application. So if you submit an incomplete application, that doesn't start a 45-day clock. But if you've done everything you need to do as an applicant, VEPC has 45 days to respond to that. And same standards as you might expect before, meeting the but-for, the process requirements and project criterion. And then we have our limit section. It's the same concept of that 40 million in aggregate lifetime, but now you can have a yearly increase if necessary. So VEPC may increase the limit by not more than 5 million upon application by the governor to the Joint Fiscal Committee. In evaluating the governor's request, the Joint Fiscal Committee is to consider the economic and fiscal condition of the state, including recent revenue forecasts and budget projections. And they're to provide testimony documentation, housing infrastructure project application data, any other information JFC requests to demonstrate that increasing the cap would create an opportunity for the creation of additional housing to meet the needs of the municipality or municipalities and the state. And just to say where this language for one-off increase of the cap comes from, we have a same kind of provision for the veggie program. So that's where this is drawn from.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, John, that was submitted on before December, so that's a kind of a 5-year win, basically sunset, right?
Yeah, it's the same
I
concept.
can't remember, so was that changed from the prior?
This is the same as I'm trying to recall because it's been through a couple of
Yeah, there's
iterations.
so many versions.
Yeah,
They moved it
yeah,
2 more years because we were talking with them. It's gonna take a year and a half for rulemaking.
Yeah,
You want to make sure that the time doesn't start until rulemaking is completed,
sure.
to give that 5-year period.
I'm just trying to remember what our the Commerce's take on that was and housing.
So it was 10 years.
10 years,
but
right?
With a 5-year look back.
Right.
yeah, it was 10 years out of commerce. It was 5 out of ways and means. And then this is slightly pushed back from that, right? And we'll see when we come to the end for the tip sunsetting where we have a similar provision that has been moved back to align with this date. So the tip, we'll come to that at the end, but yeah, the 2031 date.
Okay.
Let's see. There's some cleanup changes. This is not a substantive change coming related to the description of the termination of the housing development site. So the way that this works is your housing development site will last until you retire all debt or if you don't incur any debt until that debt incursion period ends. I would just describe this as cleanup language to make that clearer. The way that the TIF district statute works, it says shall continue until the date and hour the indebtedness is retired or 10 years following or 5 years following the creation of the district site. I think this is just more direct. It's saying if you haven't incurred any debt, your site goes away at the end of the debt incursion period. So not a substantive change, just clarifying. I think we can jump next to the rulemaking section, which is 1910F. Briefly pause my screen share to get to that. Okay. Rulemaking. So as you know, VEPC is authorized with broad rulemaking powers and then tasked with some specific directives that are mandatory. So here are the mandatory pieces governing the prioritization of applications. They need to develop rules to prioritize those applications that take into consideration the purpose of the subchapter. Previously, this said blight. It now has been changed to say vacancy or dilapidation, regional equity and verifiable housing shortages, and labor sheds. So these would be things that VEPC has to consider when prioritizing applications.
Wait, man, what's the question? Prioritization that specifies vacancy or dilapidation. is that referring to the specific project site itself? Is that referring to the
So
municipal contacts? I mean, does that mean that a greenfield project would not be prioritized as opposed to a rehab or something? Just trying to understand.
Yep, so I'll give some context and say that the short answer is we don't know how VEPC will choose to do this. What this is a directive to VEPC to create rules that allow them to guide their process for accepting applications. So they need to come up with a way of prioritizing applications as they come in because they're subject to a cap, right? So otherwise it would just be a rush until, if you think that the cap is a meaningful constraint, there would be a rush, right? If it's no constraint, then it almost doesn't sort of less meaningful. But if the cap is a constraint, then they need to prioritize applications knowing that you're going to hit a limit in a year. And when they develop the rules for that process, they just need to think about these things.
Okay, I see.
It's not about a specific application. It's about,
There's not an answer. It's a thing to consider.
yeah, exactly.
I got it.
Exactly.
Talking about the number 3 there, subdivision 3. And I'm trying to think of what the scope of that might be, John. You had the but-for test laid out, earlier. The real issue that I thought might be helpful, I threw out the notion to folks that if you had a real concrete kind of reference to the state of housing stock in a municipality, hasn't been growing by very much. You could the developer, especially a small scale developer, might be able to just point to, hey, we haven't had a whole lot of growth. And the question, I had was, whether that kind of a measure might be possible under this rulemaking authority. Is that, do you think that's kind of within the scope of, if I've articulated, okay,
I think I
is that
understand.
kind of within the scope of that subdivision 3?
So what wouldn't be within the scope of subdivision 3 is rulemaking that contradicts the but-for test.
Right.
So if there was a proposal to do something that supplemented this, that contradicted what the but-for test in statute is, that wouldn't be permissible because then the statute would trump the rule, right? So it should be consistent with what is stated as the but-for test. But perhaps they could build out housing specific ways, right, of identifying what they think is appropriate in this context. I mean, the other way to do this is that if you discover, as you go through this process of rulemaking, that there are issues with implementing the but-for test, you come back next year and change the but-for test to accommodate that, right? If you see that the only way to do it is to contradict the test and statute, you could propose changing the but-for test. But just to make clear, you couldn't do rulemaking that contradicts the statute.
Right, and the specific kind of thing, measure that I was thinking of is if you say something like, well, housing growth within a particular municipality hasn't exceeded, X% annually over the past 5 years or whatever. It could be some other measure. And I guess I was reading the previous language to say that kind of concept would not be inconsistent. But I'd be interested in your take on it.
Let me just flip back and I don't think that is inconsistent with the but-for test, which is, I think, your question.
Ah,
To put on that real quick, I'm just wondering if we're talking about regional equity, and also kind of pointing this into kind of vacant and dilapidated and preserved areas, if there is a place for LAOB in crafting the rulemaking process at all. the land access opportunity board.
Treated in
Yeah,
2022.
created in 2022 in statute.
So one of the conversations is that they have a role in figuring out where building should happen, but BEPC is about figuring out how to fund the infrastructure.
Mhm.
And there is a path already. So there's a land path already that is figuring that piece out and figuring out the what the maps should be and where the growth is should be. And but this is separate from that. This is funding. So trying to keep those two separate keeps it a little simpler, a little, no, it's, I don't know.
I think it goes back to, and this reminds me of a key thing that I omitted a few pages back. You'll recall before that when we started talking about energy efficiency and other considerations, and I kind of pushed back and said, there's different regulatory regimes for different pieces. I think that what's being described here is we have ways of targeting growth to specific areas outside the scope of this program. And this particular set of rulemaking is not about, this is just about prioritization of applications. It's not about if you can build in particular areas, right? Maybe I'm misunderstanding the scope of your question, but I think, and just so I can describe the thing that I omitted because it's something that was deleted. The big thing in this draft is that there's no location criteria, right? So this is, you can build anywhere in the state. And then what you're saying in this section is that for prioritizing applications, which only matters because there is a cap, right? If you had no cap, you don't need to prioritize applications. The prioritization of applications is saying, if we think we're going to hit this cap, let's make sure that we're thinking about regional equity. So we aren't just letting one county rush through all their projects subject to a cap and then no one else can access it.
And I think that that's also what I'm talking about. Because I mean, Edie, I understand your point, but also there is a conversation about what does equity look like in that list of prioritization. And that's where I'm wondering if that goal is appropriate.
Yeah, so it's the purpose section, right? It's the kites, the housing, the revitalization, regional equity, verifiable housing shortages and labor sheds that's listed there. I think, yeah.
And the LAOB is not necessarily just about racial equity, it's about, equity in its broadest terms. So that's also about region and location too.
You're asking if they could have a say in,
I mean, and I think this may be a next year conversation and a broader conversation about how they're potentially brought into FC's process of rulemaking if we are setting these priorities on where things are supposed to be and also what the prioritization criteria are to meet the standard or the cap rather.
I think I at least better understand the question now. I don't know that, I think it's a policy choice, yeah. Other pieces here, we've already talked about it, but the specific directives determine appropriate floor area measure because we're agnostic in the project criterion as to what that is, gross floor area, usable space, have BEPC determine what the appropriate floor area measure would be. And then we've talked about this before test under subdivision 3. We have another instance of deleted language you're not seeing here from the Ways and Means proposal. In the Ways and Means proposal, there's a requirement for prior to pre-filing of any draft rules with ICAR that the rules be submitted to the Joint Fiscal Committee for their review 45 days prior to that. That's been struck out. So quicker process, less burdensome.
I think we discussed that a little bit, but the chairs of all the relevant committees will get a copy of the rules that are being proposed and have an opportunity to give their input, whether or not those rules meet legislative intent. And so if they go out of their scope, I can, Mark can, Emily can, same on the Senate side, can provide that guidance to Elcar when they're looking at the proposal. So there's gonna be a lot of eyes on it, as well as legislative council as well. And I mean, when I get those pamphlets, I look at it and I also have a discussion with legislative council and make sure that we're on the same page.
The other changes here are, we've talked about removing the board, so that would have been previously here, right before section 26, so that's been deleted. There's no chip board in this amendment. And the other change you see is to the composition of BEPC's board. So with the removal of the chip board, there was still a desire, I think, to get at housing expertise in review of these applications. So what you see on page 24 is for the members of the BEPC board, adding for the purposes of reviewing and approving housing infrastructure project applications under the CHIP program, the council would additionally have 2 voting members, executive director of VHFA or designee, and executive director of VHCB or designee, and then as a non-voting member, the commissioner of GHCD or designee. So adding some housing expertise to the board solely for the purpose of the CHIP program. Obviously, they wouldn't be touching veggie or the like, right?
I just want to add, and Emily here, VHCB is one of the members, they support the board, so the land access.
Yeah, and I
So there's another connect. I
Yeah.
hear what you're saying. I'm just saying, like.
yeah, no,
there is a clear-
I see it, I see it a lot, I appreciate it.
This had crossed my mind earlier today, and I would like, just curious if replacing VHCB, for example, in an odd spot to be voting on projects that, given the existence of a cap, might have impacts on availability of funds for projects that they may in fact also be I'm trying to get, I don't know if it goes as far as a conflict of interest. I think everybody would recuse themselves from votes that might that they would directly impact their own organizations. But if there's only X dollars available and projects are coming in, does that place anyone in a tough spot in terms of like, here's the pipeline, here's what's coming. I know what's coming on the pike from my organization. I can do the math. Is that, are there statutory, is it fine that way? Is it uncomfortable that way? Am I making this thing up and it doesn't really exist?
So I think I don't know the answer to that question. His reaction was just, are we talking about different pools of money, right? In this case, we're talking about taking future property tax revenues to fund particular projects. So I'm not sure that I think you're identifying that people might be competing for the same funds. And are you asking if VHCB would be part of applications under the CHIP
For
program?
example, yeah, that is what I'm asking. But that's what I'm positing.
Yeah.
And if so, would they be comfortable having a voting role in that instance?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think you're right to identify that if that was the case, it would create a conflict of interest, but I don't.
If they weren't a cap, I'd feel a little less concerned about it.
I think they fund, so they would fund a regional housing organization, so.
Okay.
And so, and I think, and the same for VHFA as well. Right?
They are
They're fundor. That's another tranche of money. This is, I don't know that they fund infrastructure.
Yeah.
Or do they fund the project? So
it may actually not be relevant to, okay. That'd be good.
And I guess actually here's that's for me, another plug for the LAAP, because they're in a advisory role and really like are not necessarily dispensing funds for projects.
Makes sense. Yeah, perfect.
So getting back to, what the scope of Betsy rules could be. And yeah, you can't adopt the rule, it's gonna be consistent with statute, because. And thinking about the improvements definition, I think I know the answer to this, unfortunately. The amendment excludes, some, in my mind, pretty critical pieces of infrastructure for housing in a rural, small scale rural kind of development. Electric utilities, private driveways. And I'll ask you just to confirm what I think I know, which is that Betsy could not adopt a rule. Well, let me ask you, would Betsy be able to adopt a rule that includes things like private driveways, things like electric utilities within as improvable infrastructure, housing infrastructure?
So what I would say is unlike TIF districts where rulemaking could build out what improvements are, because the definition of improvements for TIF districts is expansive, right? It's a bucket with a non-exhaustive list. Because what is provided here is an exhaustive list, I would say that that is in conflict with the statute. But I'm also not I'm not the one who has the say on that. So,
Concurrent objection to.
but I would say it wouldn't be hard to look and see that in one case we provide a non-exhaustive list and in the other we provide an exhaustive. And so an attempt to expand the exhaustive list seems pretty clearly to me.
Plus you have the history of the different amendments as it got to the legislature. It's quick change.
So if you wanted that, I would say you would want to add it to statute. So, yeah.
On that whole thing about an exhaustive list, I am concerned that the definition of improvements or doesn't actually say, I think rehab or rehabilitation, which we had in our initial amendment. I think it says the installation or construction of, but it
Mhm.
doesn't specifically say
Rehabilitation. right?
rehabilitation of infrastructure. I think I would like to see that put back in because the list is exhaustive. In construction, or at the very least, construction itself is not defined. And it's in that lack of definition also does not say. Yeah. I guess from a legal standpoint, is that a concern?
If you want to cover rehabilitation, I would say it. Yes.
Rehabilitation of the
Of the
infrastructure.
of infrastructure.
So needed to
Wastewater repair, so
do sewer lines in, because the old ones, you need a bigger diameter.
yeah,
That
or
wouldn't be allowable.
No, so I think if you're constructing new, I was imagining this is like repairing
No, this is what I
existing
mean, we're just
infrastructure rather
repair.
than replace. If you're replacing, I read that as you're installing or constructing this thing.
What would be
I don't know.
repair and infrastructure that wouldn't be,
that wouldn't be covered?
because I think if it's a really gonna tear things out and put new in, right? You're not gonna just take a section.
I mean, I don't know what the infrastructure project is.
Well, what if it's like an intersection that needs to be made bigger? And lights and stuff. Would that be construction?
Or like, or the repair, rehabilitation of public roads or.
I think both sides are expressing justifiable confusion. I would just say the clearer you can be, the better. I think you're right. you're expanding things, it sounds like new construction, you're constructing that piece that should be covered. But if you just want to be doubly sure, you could say rehabilitation, right? And avoid the question entirely.
Is there a downside to putting rehabilitation in? I mean, if there aren't really any rehabilitations.
Let me pull up just what we say for TIF districts, because I think we say installation or construction. We say reconstruction is included for TIF districts, so.
Installation, construction, or reconstruction.
Just to match what is for TIF districts.
Okay, let's note that and we'll have conversation amongst the proposers of the amendment. No, it hasn't been. Possible change.
The last thing I did not get to, very end of the amendment. The TIF district the sunsetting of applications for tax increment financing for TIF districts in Title 32. That's been extended to December 31, 2031. So to align with the same date that you see for the CHIP program application deadline. And that is the full amendment.
Can I ask a question about the, going back to page 8, where we have our but for offense? Since we have 2 increments that can be retained, is it how can one, if we say, but for the incentive, the project wouldn't be feasible? Is the thought, I'm just curious, like, is there especially looking at that second section where we're talking about how it would differ and if applicable to the housing development and the number of units of mixed income housing.
Mhm.
It makes me wonder if then I'm looking at a project that doesn't have mixed income housing, I have the lower retainer or I have the lower increment, and the thought is, no, add some mixed income housing, get yourself to the 85. Is it possible to have the but-for test passed? That's where, like, is this creating a moment where it's like, well, the way to make it work is to go up to 85 or go up to 80, excuse me. And is that sort of, maybe that's the purpose of an incentive, but I'm also wondering, is it the way you set up a but-for test with 2 tiers? Does it create any?
I don't think the but-for test asks you to go to 80%. What it's asking if it could have happened in the absence of the financing. So if your project wouldn't pencil out at 60%, but would at the 80% for the mixed income, then it is directing you to do that. But it wouldn't be the but-for test that's directing you to do that, right? It would be the fact that your project doesn't work unless you get the 80. So that's not a function of the but-for test. That's just a function of the math. And I think, we don't know, but the 20% increment difference between standard project and the mixed income is meant to make available an incentive to opt for the mixed income, right? If it was small enough, it might never make sense for someone to go to the mixed income because the math will work better at say a 70% or something along those lines. But I think the answer to your question is, I don't think it's the but-for test that would be driving someone to a different increment level.
So it wouldn't be the case then that that Pepsi would be assessing, you're only going to look at the scenario that is provided by the applicant.
Yeah, you're asking if it could have happened without the increment that they're seeking, basically.
Or could it have happened with the greater increments that you seem to not want because you're not applying for that? That's maybe what I'm really trying to get at.
I guess,
That would be an unusual way to go about it.
yeah, I might have to think more about that, but I don't think this is a test that is pushing Betsy to say, why don't you go for the 80%? It's just a question of if the project pencils out.
The questions? No?
I don't fully understand the definition of this mixed income housing, 20%. Like that means anything that has a affordability covenant on it?
Has one of these housing subsidy covenants under the Title 27. Which just to,
20% would need to have a covenant
that's
of any
right,
kind.
they would need to have this housing subsidy covenant,
Yeah.
yes.
See whether it's permanently, whether the different percentages of AMI.
Yep.
Is
And people could target those to different income levels, right? The housing subsidy covenant is not, that statutory reference is not specific as to a certain target, right?
I see.
That's a question about that.
is CHIP itself the housing subsidy covenant in that instance?
I'm not sure I understand
In looking at the 610,
like what are the eligibility kick-ins for this?
Yeah, when it
So
talks
you're
about,
accessing
and is the incentive from CHIP the thing? Or are there other, that's what I'm getting at, is, as it articulates the subsidies, I was wondering, is the CHIP the subsidy that makes this a relevant statute? Or does it imply that, or require that you're using other subsidy? And that's why I got a little confused there.
I don't think it requires using another, certainly not the intent to require use of another program to access the housing subsidy covenants. Let me just pull up the statute.
I think most places, when you're doing the mixed, you're gonna have other funding,
Anyway, yeah.
right? And this is another incentive, a separate incentive.
I was wondering if CHIP was that too, if that was the grants made by a political subdivision, the state is the CHIP, and that's what makes this.
You're asking how this is the correct reference to use, I think, like how is it picked
Yeah.
up? And I think it could be argued that it falls into multiple of these buckets, right? It's a subsidized transaction as well.
The subsidy is. And I think,
So could this subsidy be the thing that makes it subsidized housing?
yeah, I was getting tripped up on this reference to statute over the last week, and I guess I'm still getting tripped up. And I had thought that perhaps the deal was that by utilizing CHIP, it is as a condition of that number 2 there. Or that, otherwise I'm like, how is the subsidy? What is the subsidy? And I also thought perhaps it was, as you articulated, that's how Vermont produces income restricted housing, is with external subsidies through other partners. My alarm there is that I think a lot of that's federal dollars, and I'm worried about the federal government not being a reliable dance partner at this time. But I was wondering if 610 was referring to CHIP itself as the subsidy.
So it may make sense for an applicant to avail themselves of a traditional affordable housing partner in the process. But I don't think that they have to do that to access this covenant.
In which case the subsidy is. In which case, it's using the section housing subsidy covenant. And I'm just wondering if it's not through that conventional trajectory you just articulated.
This is just trying to provide a means for applying a covenant that is targeted to particular kinds of restrictions like resale price, restriction on tenant income, and rents. So it's just calling out a reference to a covenant that can build in those kinds of restrictions. And it's meant to be more flexible than an approach that specifies a particular AMI target. I take your point that the phrase housing subsidy covenant, right, is the thing ringing the bells for you.
It is.
Covenant CHIP isn't a covenant. CHIP is an incentive program.
Yes.
So I think they're very separate. I hear what you're saying, but I think that they're very separate.
Oh, I agree. And I noticed, I understood that we used, that we needed to get the covenants into play for the perpetuity elements. And so the definition brings that in. I then was just, I think maybe John, we can call it whatever. It doesn't need, we could have called it any old thing. And maybe I was like, well, what's the subsidy?
Right.
And that might just be a red herring, I think is what I'm hearing, because the purpose of tying it to 610 was simply so that we had a covenant in place.
Yep.
Not so that we could say, and this is a subsidy covenant. And so I just wanted to make sure I was
I'm
clear on that.
I'm happy to think more about it, but that's my, yeah.
Getting back to rulemaking authority again, my favorite topic. I'm trying to remember the language, but I think it said that, was it just limited to but for issues that subdivision 3 there? Was it just limited to but for, or was it any provision?
You're talking about the subdivision 3 in the rulemaking. It is a directive to supplement the but-for test. But know that Pepsi has broad rulemaking authority
And
as reasonably necessary to implement the subchapter. So they have broad rulemaking authority. Those are just, you can imagine that gives Pepsi the choice as to what things they think are appropriate. The 3 directives are just, you shall specifically undertake rulemaking on these fronts, but it's not to the exclusion of other kinds of rulemaking.
that's good to know, because I'm thinking of some of the small scale kind of projects. Trying to develop a covenant in accordance with Title 27 statute might be challenging, from some of these smaller scale developments. It would be really nice to have, if Pepsi could construct a sort of a boilerplate, okay, this will work kind of thing, as opposed to folks trying to clean it up. So maybe that could be within.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're identifying one of the broad tensions in the bill, which is to provide flexibility to folks at the same time that you provide simplicity. So you can be prescriptive as to pieces, but then you remove the flexibility for folks to take different approaches. So I don't know what all the sorts of things that Pepsi will undertake in rulemaking, but I think you're identifying a fair concern. Yeah.
Questions? We'll run a flagpole about adding reconstructions with the language. So that, it's time for a straw poll of where we are on this amendment that we can pass on to Ways and Means. Or any other comments or questions that anyone has?
I really appreciate the work that you and Edie did on getting rid of application criteria. I think there are some other amendments that incorporated in here that I really think are helpful. I still have some concerns around some of those issues that I think might make it less than useful, for some projects, smaller projects in other parts of the state. And I tried to identify a few of those issues. Maybe they could be done in rulemaking. Be more comfortable if there was some explicit language, directing the Pepsi, deal with some of these issues in rulemaking. I also don't know what the stage, we got a House thing, the Senate conference committee, that whole process. So I'm just not sure, how to go about doing that. Right now, I think there still needs work to be done. I think But that doesn't. Still trying to toss in my mind, whether this is good enough to get to us to a point that, we ultimately get something that's useful for everyone.
I just want to remind everyone that this project-based TIF, mini TIF idea has been on probably for 7 years now, maybe longer. In some iterations, it's gone through this committee a few times. Get us to this place where we actually get it out of Ways and Means is a huge victory to get us to a smaller TIF that can help our smaller community. And then continuing to work with us and with House General, along with members of Ways and Means, to try to get this amendment through. We've been stretching the rubber band pretty far. And we are getting close to being out of time. And I think that we really need to just get it to conference. Where, possibly other things can happen. There's also rulemaking that needs to be done, and there's also a check-in next year. See how things are going, and if they're having difficulties in doing some things that may need some changes and more direction to Betsy, then that we can do that as well. So there's never going to be perfection. There's always going to be some need for retooling things, I think. So I think with this amendment that we're in a much better place than we were at the end of last week. So, okay.
A couple of questions, if I may. Can you share with us the history of having a sunset date for general TIF, which is something I'm hearing from quite a bit from my constituents?
I don't remember, I think it was prior to 2017. Every 2 or 3 years, we were extending the sunset on TIF. So it's not foreign. That's been done before. And I think it got to the point where we created, I think, 6 TIFs, the availability of 6 TIFs. No more than 2 per county. And as we had those discussions, we also understood that something came up in a county that already had 2. There is always the notwithstanding language that we could use to approve another one in another county. So, that led us to a path where we didn't have to be coming back every 2 or 3 years to extend the sunset. I think there's still 4 left.
Oh, the remaining that are available?
Available TIFs,
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head.
3 or 4, I think. So I think what Ways and Means, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I think what they're looking at is by aligning the sunsets to CHIP and TIF, that we take a very broad look at how this is affecting the education fund, and especially after the changes that will be made in education financing going forward. And so, my thought is that we will see a positive influence on the education property tax fund, if by what's going on, especially in CHIP. Because I think we're going to be building things that never would have been built before. And we should start seeing additional funding going into the education fund. That's my thought. And so it's not entirely a bad thing to put a sunset on. It's a reevaluation, making sure that we're on the right path as well. So when we look at both programs, I think there's always going to be a need for TIF as well, because there's going to be commercial expansion that municipalities are going to want, especially the bigger ones. That's what it's made for. So that's my thoughts.
A follow-up on that, that is the feedback I'm getting, is that we really need TIF. We don't want to see TIF go away. So if I can go back and assure those people it's because of the added complexities now of CHIP.
Well, I think
Want to take a look at the,
and not understanding yet how the education fund, how the
Exactly.
funding formula is gonna work and what is that going to do to everything? I think it's,
my other question is, do we know what the vote on the, in the Senate was on their version of this bill? Did, yeah,
It was unanimous.
yeah,
I heard 30-0.
Michael?
Better than what came out, right? That's the case. Hulu would not qualify for CHIP, correct? Hula, sorry, Hulu. Hula.
It depends if they put the application in, right? So they would.
They're moving forward, so they wouldn't qualify.
I don't see why not.
Yeah, I think
It's
if
just-
they have approval in the end, I think they're good, right?
But for,
Well, they've got a long ways to go, but
I think they think, but for something like CHIP, they won't be able to do.
Yeah.
That's what they said.
okay.
I mean, there's a but for and TIF too, so.
Right.
No, I get it.
The but for in either place that they go for, the construction improvement.
But I just, my level of frustration is pretty high with a couple expletives put in there. Because I feel like I get back to my original comment, which is I think we should have just passed it the way that the Senate did it. And I know that I'm not, not everybody's there with me on that. And, we're close, right? We're close. I mean, the closest apparently that we've been ever. And, will I support the amendment, which is better than what was provided to us? Yes, but I still want the other. And it's a little frustrating. It's not a little frustrating. It's wildly irritating beyond all comprehension that I just must stop talking.
So my thoughts are, to start with, thanks for all your work.
Yes.
I think it is a significant improvement from last week. And I mean, I think my concern, and hopefully this will be looked at in conference committee, is that we sort of are approaching this with two big guardrails, the but-for test and the cap, which to me is kind of redundant. Like if you pass the but-for test, why do you need a cap? But if there's a cap, why do you need a but-for test? And the rulemaking and the layers of approval and bureaucracy that result. So that's my concern, is that this will take, how long will it take for rulemaking, especially with the rules surrounding multiple things. And that said, it's coming along, and I appreciate the hard work, and let's hopefully we can get it to the next step.
So I appreciate the work of the committee, and it's certainly better than what we had. But I don't think it's good enough. I still think it's way too restrictive. I agree with Abby. We have a but for and a cap. We seem very redundant. All this additional stuff is going to delay the problem you know, now no one's gonna really be able to do anything. If my understanding is correct, because you have to wait for the rulemaking. Well, that's gonna take a year. So now we're kicking this down the road another year. I still think it's too restrictive. And I feel like we are putting a Band-Aid on a bleed that needs a tourniquet. And I honestly think that a lot of people think this is just people are just gonna rush in. And because of all the restrictions that we put on, it's probably I'm concerned it's gonna be a trickle. And we're gonna wind up with almost nothing. Now, that said, I would rather have 50% of something than 100% of nothing. So I will vote definitely to move the bill forward.
And I think if what say comes to fruition, that it's gonna be known that we need to make adjustments.
But, and I understand that, but at some point, it's gonna be too little too late. I mean, we are hemorrhaging people that are workforce level. I personally know 14 people that are leaving this state because they can't find a place to live, they can't find a job, it's too expensive. How much longer can we afford to allow people to leave this state for better places? How much longer before it just becomes, I don't know what we're gonna do. I mean, what happens when there's not enough people in the state to support the budget? That's my concern. And I feel like the path we're going right now, that's where we're gonna wind up.
So,
Sorry. At that point, I certainly don't want to be in a position of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think and I really appreciate it. I know you all have worked really hard on this. I really, really appreciate it. And I know that if it goes to conference, more work will be done at it. I guess, I think I said my little pieces in my picadillos. I think I was thinking about your query, Mike, on the rehab thing. And I think some of my concern there is also just like, as we see our plate of money stack start to dry up, are we gonna have to make some rough choices about how we do development? And do we want to have enough coverage in this for now to have that happen? And then as far as the rulemaking, I understand that adding more rules is a whole heck of a lot, but if that equity piece is in there, I think since LAOB is literally like an advisory role, it might be a good thing to have them in there. I'm really grateful about the location criteria. That is a huge lift for me.
Yes.
But yeah, like I said, I have no interest in letting the perfect be the enemy of good. I'm, in some ways honored to have worked on something that has moved this far.
Take the credit, it's you. Yeah, just, I kind of rambled the last time. Say something, I'm gonna support this amendment. And I'm gonna do that because I think it's a way to get it to conference committee. I also think there might be some amendments, offered on the floor that we should, think about. I don't know what they're gonna be. But I will be, I'll vote for them.
anybody else? Dave?
Yeah, I'm concerned about this not helping rural Vermont as much as we'd like because of the cap and what I consider to be too short look back time, even though it's been pushed out. I think it's an issue of capacity for rural Vermont. John, if you could help me out, you work at an RPC, right? You cover how many towns?
17 municipalities.
17 municipalities. So they're going to be fighting for, most of them, I assume, don't have their own staff. So they'd be fighting for the resources available through you. Whereas the municipalities that are already locked and loaded are going to be able to step right out and boom, we're up against the cap. So, but on the other hand, I'm persuaded by the argument that this is the first time we've gotten this far. And if I may, I think we have a Neil Armstrong moment here, one small step for rural Vermont, and let's do it and plant that foot on the moon.
Well,
Sorry, folks, I tend to get into those pension.
I don't know how you follow Neil Armstrong. That's ask Buzz Aldrin. When we bought our house in Pownell in 2022, there were two other houses in Bennington County that were also on the market in that price range of $50,000, and that's crazy. I mean, I think that's a disaster. And I'm glad that we're taking steps to I don't know, to think about the students who would be in those schools, but for the difficulty in permitting, the houses that would be on the market, but for the challenges in acquiring capital. And my anxieties around where we're tying a lot of this, I think, are we can see what will happen. And I think that if we have a legislature that's willing to be open to tweaking something, if need be, then that's great. And so I'm, feeling good about proceeding, with the straw poll. And I think I'm really glad, as people have said, to see that we'll find ways to see how many municipalities, how many rural communities can get in the game. And it will be a function, I think, of who's there to help them. 17 is a lot smaller number than however many dozen are in NVDA's purview in the Northeast Kingdom. So, we'll continue. All the rubber bands are stretched. So this I think, gets us closer to where the governor sort of asked us to go with his public statements on this, I think, on Friday. And hopefully we can continue to work towards that, because it would be nice to see more kids in some of the schools that could triple their population and have plenty of room. And some of those are in my district. So I'm excited about this. I think this is in a good spot.
And I think we really need to give some thought about capacity. What's Betsy's capacity to run applications through? What's the capacity to construct? What's the capacity of affordability that people can afford? What's the capacity to make these things pencil out? So there's a lot more going on than just providing the infrastructure, right? And I think you're right. I think next year we need to really talk about more support for municipalities, like we did with MTAT, and other programs such as that we can get the RPCs and the RDCs and the LCT and whoever else is out there to assist our municipalities and the small ones in being able to provide application. I think one thing that's built in here is the ability for municipalities to negotiate a contract with a sponsor or developer where they don't have to go through a bond, going through that whole process that really shortens the time period of them being able to get projects going. So, and then on top of that, they're coming to Betsy with a contract with somebody. With TIF, they've been talking to developers, but there's no contract there. They're going into that partially blinded. Going through that whole process of going to bond, getting approval from the voters of the municipality. I think we saw it here in Montpelier where they went through that whole thing and then so I think there's some good things here that are built in that are in the front loaded that is more predictable, especially for small communities. So and I think as we go along, we continue to adjust and look and talk. And so, that 40 million a year, I think everybody would love not to have a cat. That's the world we're in right now. but I think it's a pretty large one, and can we even, can we even get to that cap in 1 year? Because of capacity issue. So everything's unseen right now because it's in the program. Anything else?
I just, since I haven't said anything, yeah, I mean, I agree largely with everybody's concerns. I strongly disagree with the cap, but I'll support this because I want to get it moving out of here, and I super appreciate your work.
I was just gonna say, I want this program for Vermont. I want this program on the books. I think it's gonna be easier to tweak once it's on the books than it is to get on the books. And I think we're on that path there, and I hope we can get there. And I'm mildly optimistic that we can do that. And so I think that that's what's keeping me going with this. Every little tweak makes it better, and I think well, not every, but almost every little tweak makes it better, and I think we're doing the right thing. Doing this. I know we're.
I do want to say that what our committee did originally was the best product, of course. And I think that needs to be on the record. Just as a side note.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We did the best work. That being said, did you say municipalities don't have to vote?
It
It depends, if they choose to bond. Right, so if they're gonna go through the bonding process, and they have to go through that whole process of bringing it to the electorate and having it voted on. If they are not going to bond, they don't have to have a vote, they have to present it to the electorate. But they don't, there's no vote required. So if the developer sponsor is going to take the loan out and pay and do the infrastructure themselves, then there's no vote required. So that shortens the time period quite a bit.
But I think it also helps small scale projects that, the amount of capital that you need for an 8 unit kind of development, this might not need a bond, They get their business of getting that sort of capital anyway, and they need to, have a bond and a vote.
Anything else? Well, all in favor of moving forward with the amendment to the Ways and Means Amendment, raise your hand. And Ms. Kirk on, do we know? No, okay. 10-01.
Were we going to see if we could get reconstruction added?
I sent it to the others. I
Okay,
don't see a reason why, but I forwarded that to the others that are on the amendment, see if they're agreeable with that.
be fine either way, but I just wondered where we were with that.
I mean, I think it makes sense because it aligns to the TIP program as well, right?
I think it also aligns with what Ways and Means originally had, so I would be surprised if there's.
Okay. So our next discussion is at 10:45. Todd's coming in from the AG's office to talk about rulemaking fees. So